All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the September 28th edition of the Microsoft 365 Meetup for Government. Very happy to have our presenter this evening, Bobby Chang, to talk to us about upping your SharePoint game with the Power Platform. So want to just remind everyone who may be new or returning this evening about our community mission statement. This community is really intended to be a networking opportunity for information technology professionals who are working either with Microsoft technology or in the government space or both. And we definitely want people to learn, grow, introduce themselves to each other, and drive both their business and mission objectives. For those who are part of the community, we ask everyone to be respectful and considerate. Please do not share proprietary or other non-public information. You certainly are allowed to self-promote, or whether it be your organization or personally, but please keep it reasonable, no spam. And we definitely want to remind everybody that this is a community event, so all of us, whether we work as for Microsoft, for other partners, for government organizations, we're here in our personal capacities to learn and grow, and nothing here reflects the organizations for which we work. I want to thank our co-sponsors and organizers, Andrew Kagan and Andy Oak from Planet Technologies, who, along with myself, help make these sessions a possibility, as well as the many presenters and, of course, most importantly, you, the audience. If you're not familiar with Teams as a meeting platform, please take a minute to familiarize yourself. The most important things for you to know tonight will be able to use the raise hand functionality if you have questions or would like to make a comment, as well as where the mute and unmute button are, and then also the meeting chat, which is the chat bubble. So if you have questions or comments and don't feel like asking them out loud, you're welcome to put them in the meeting chat. And if you are interested in presenting content at this or a future session, please fill out our call for content form, and we'll definitely be in touch with you to consider your submissions and talk about when we might be able to schedule you as a presenter. We definitely value feedback, both for these events and in particular for the speakers. So please take time to fill out the feedback form. I know it only takes a few minutes. It's a few questions, so it's one extra thing to do, but it really is invaluable for allowing our speakers to know how well they were effective in delivering the content, improve their own personal presentation skills, as well as let us know for these community events if they're serving the purpose that they're intended to. So without further ado, I want to turn things over to Bobby and give him the max amount of time. So Bobby, thank you for joining us, and please take it away.
Hey, thanks so much, Nick, and thank you, Andrew, Andy, and the whole Microsoft 365 Meetup for Government. You know, it was a pleasure to talk to you today about SharePoint specifically and upping your SharePoint game with the Power Platform. In case we haven't met before, my name is Bobby Chang. I'm a technology specialist with Microsoft, and I'm actually local to the DC area and grew up through the SharePoint community route. And prior to Microsoft, worked with a lot of Microsoft Gold and Premier partners, just like Planet Technologies, a lot of really smart guys and gals to implement SharePoint and Office 365. So it's really good to come back home. My focus now is in the Power Platform from a technology platform perspective, but it's always good to kind of come back to, you know, what I call my home in terms of Microsoft 365 and the SharePoint folk. That is probably a lot of you on the call. So if we haven't met before, hello, and please feel free to Nick's point to unmute if you have any questions. If you want to connect, really want to reach out to the social media world to talk anything about Power Platform, love to do that. And please feel free to reach out and love to connect with you. And once we get out of this thing that we're in the middle of, you can see my hair is a little bit longer than this profile pic. It is the same guy that you're talking to, that I'd love to actually hang out with you, hopefully in person in the near future here too. So let us start talking about what we talk about when we talk about Power Platform and what it means to up your SharePoint game, right? In order for us to talk to that, before we go into the SharePoint lens, we have to kind of bring it up a notch too in terms of what the problem statement is that we're trying to solve here. When we talk about Power Platform, specifically low-code, no-code technology using the Microsoft technology, we're really solving a need at a global level in terms of the surging application demand that we have to meet, right? Tons of apps that needs to be developed, and stop me if you heard this, there's not enough developer to tackle to those challenges, right? So you have a huge app dev backlog. You don't have enough people to meet it in order to create this really purpose-built business solutions to solve those pain points and problems. So you're going to get into this app gap in terms of being able to satisfy people's demand and organization in order to address those business challenges. So what we start to see, not just in Microsoft, but across the industry, is the shift to this idea and concept of low code, no code. How can we make it easy for people that do not necessarily come in from the development background like myself? I graduated from a business school. I do not have C# background, but I know what business pain points are. I know a little bit about the technology. What can I do to marry the two together to really start to address the heart of the problem here in terms of what business can do to move forward in order to address those challenges, right? So that's where we come in from a Power Platform side, is how do we start to position services that could be focused on the citizen development side, the folks that do not have the development background, to be able to create something that's truly transformational in an organization. So when we talk about Power Platform, and it's a really big platform, but we're going to just simplify it and talk about very high level, 4-level services, right? And a lot of you probably already know this. So we want to focus a little bit on the introductory side on this session. So if you do have components that you want to bring up and talk through, please be sure to do that. Just to set the level, we're going to talk a little bit on the introductory side here in terms of Power Platform and SharePoint. So the first service in Power Platform that we're going to touch upon very briefly is Power BI. It's the ability to create dashboard and actionable insights and create things in, in a very pictorial way and an engaging way where people can dive in and derive more insights through dashboard and analytics. The second service inside of the Power Platform is Power Apps. It's the ability to create mobile apps and form development, focus on low code and no code tooling. And if you haven't seen Power Apps and worked with Power Apps, you're going to be able to see what that looks like and how it drives today. The third service in the umbrella of Power Platform is Power Automate. It's the ability to create end-to-end intelligent automation as a focus of the Power Platform as well. It's kind of the things that runs behind the scene, right? But things that we want to make sure that, hey, as things are happening in one service, we want to potentially replicate that, escalate that in another. So you might start with Outlook, for example, maybe stop and fetch information from ServiceNow and be able to escalate appropriately inside of a Teams chat, scenarios like that. And finally, if you are in the government community cloud, this one might be the newest one to you. Is Power Virtual Agent. It's the ability to create intelligent chatbot also for low code, no code audience. So the ability to push chatbots for both internal and external audience to be able to have a conversation that's rich, that is personalized to you in order to derive that information, right? You might be an internal folks that might just want to find out about HR FAQ, your types of benefits, how much leave you have in terms of hours are left. Those kinds of information now is delivered and can be focused through the Power Platform in a low code, no code way. If you do not know much about Power Virtual Agent, it is available in the US government cloud, both in GCC and GCC High offering today. So if you do have any questions specifically about Power Virtual Agent, we have a lot of learning modules that we could provide to you. There's Power Virtual Agent in a day where you can get hands-on with the technology yourself. If you are in DoD and are sitting in this call today, it is coming. It's still to be determined. We hope to deliver the capability for the DoD cloud sometime at the end of this year or at the beginning of next year is currently where the product group is tracking for that capability. To go back to where we were on the umbrella of Power Platform, Power BI, Power Apps, and Power Automate from an availability perspective, it's there already in all of our US government offering, right? So whether you're sitting in GCC, sitting in GCC High, or in DoD, they're all available in there for you for Power Platform. Walking really quickly in terms of the different types of transformation and the buckets of areas where we see a lot of Power Platform movement is these four big areas, right? And I'm not trying to limit the use cases and the things that you can use Power Platform with, but this is just generally the four areas that we see types of modernization happening across the Power Platform customers and not excluding federal government. So the first thing that we're seeing is this concept of extending Office 365. That's the focus that we're going to have today. So thinking about, hey, do we have InfoPath modernization that we're doing here. Is there a SharePoint design or workflow that was running on premises? Now that we moved that to SharePoint Online, we're looking sort of to a newer way to do things that's a little bit more modern, maybe more mobile focused, right? All those extension story in terms of you're already using Office 365 now, you're having a meeting right now through the Meetup through Microsoft Teams, you're doing emails through Outlook already. Can we leave you where you are from a productivity perspective, but be able to create an application on top of that, a workflow on top of that, a dashboard on top of that to just extend where you are from a productivity perspective. So we're seeing a lot of customer sort of playing in this space of, hey, we're super productive right now. Can we be even better with the things that we're using on a day-to-day basis from a collaboration perspective? What we're seeing a lot as well is this concept of extending legacy application. Let's face it, a lot of us here, I assume, are working with federal government, right? Whether you are a full-time employee or you're a contractor or you are a service provider, right? You are facilitating those conversations with organizations that have legacy application that's been around for 20, 30 plus years, right? The reason why it's hard to completely modernize away from this legacy application is because there is so many things that is orchestrated in and out of those legacy backend, right? Microsoft IT is actually not excluded from that too. If you follow any of our example from previous Ignites about 2 or 3 years ago, we have this application that a full-time employee for Microsoft like Nick and myself would have to go to called the Thrive app, right? Thrive apps allows you to give kudos. Hey, Nick, you're doing a good job. I'm going to give you a kudo for running this Microsoft 365 meetup for government on a monthly basis. On top of that, what the Thrive app provides too, which sits on Power App, is the ability to enter time and absence reporting that for us before Power Apps, Nick and I would have to go in through VPN, go into a really old user interface that's not accessible through mobile to be able to tell our manager that we're planning to take the day off or we were sick yesterday to kind of go through the time and absence reporting, right? And Microsoft IT tried so hard to get out of that business to remove themselves from that dependency of that old legacy system so that our employees could have a really fresh lens, a mobile lens, in order to just simply put in a time and absence reporting. And they tried so many times and they failed. So what the compromise has, the compromise at this point is that, hey, we're going to leave the legacy application sort of in the back end because there's so many things feeding into and out of that system, but we're going to get the fresh modernization lens to it so that the employees can go in. I can go to my Android now, access the Thrive app, and be able to submit my time reporting directly to my manager without having the VPN in. So we're seeing a lot of use cases sort of on this side of the realm too, where we're saying, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Customer, you have a legacy application that needs to still be sustained indefinitely. We don't want you to rip and replace, keep it there. Let's go ahead and actually put you a fresh new lens on top of your legacy backend that might be a little bit more mobile focused. And what we're seeing is that this different types of solution could be a team, an org unit, or a department focused components, all the way out to be scalable, to be enterprise-wide, that just touching, 400,000, 800,000 people type of organization, right? We're seeing a lot of Power Apps components that are small use case, 10 to 15 people, but also scale out to the entire enterprise to be able to do things like that we're going through right now, like vaccination requirements, return to work, being able to scale out to make sure that as we are letting people back into the facility, that they're doing it in an intentional and safe way. A lot of those components are done through Power Apps app modernization perspective. What we want to focus on today, though, is this concept of native integration that's just built in Office 365. What can Power Platform do with this native integration with Office 365, right? And since we are Microsoft 365 people, most likely some of you in this call already know what this logo is, right? Spoiler alert, I already said it earlier. This is InfoPath, right? I spent a lot of time in InfoPath. When I work with Planet, I spent hours and created many InfoPath forms for several federal agencies that's probably still running today. I love it, and it was very transformational at its time. It's still doing a lot currently, but I kind of throw an analogy for InfoPath as sort of my first car, right? My first car in high school is this bad boy right here. Toyota Corolla 1987, right? I love it. I still love it. If I have it right now, I would drive it, right? It's awesome. You can kind of weave in and out of traffic. I'm going through like I-95 and you can just kind of zip through, reliable. The gas mileage is phenomenal, right? I still love it to today. But it comes to a certain point, just like this Toyota Corolla, where InfoPath is going to start to collect depth. So in the InfoPath world, we call that the technical debt, right? In the car world, you're going to have to start to put in new transmission. There's the new timing belt, and then you get to the radiator, and then you have to change the engine block. At a certain point, it's not worth keeping this really awesome car because of all those components that you have to pay back in order to maintain a legacy car or a legacy system like InfoPath. So if we wanted to just do a quick roundup of what is supported today, of course, InfoPath is still supported today until 2026, but there's other things from both forms and workflow orchestration in SharePoint that's sort of like nearing the deprecation side or already has been deprecated. So if we are sitting in the federal organizations today and you're using this on premises, you're thinking of modernizing to SharePoint Online, if you haven't started to think about what to take on next, this would be a good time to do a quick self-assessment, right? Hey, we're still standing up new InfoPath here. We know there's going to be 3,000 people that's hitting this form. Could we entertain new, more modern, more mobile-friendly capabilities that might already be available to your agencies, right? So things like SharePoint Designer Workflow, things like SharePoint 2010 Workflow, Access Services, a lot of these form and workflow components that is SharePoint focused is no longer supported, especially if you're already in SharePoint Online. So something that, again, just do a quick self-reflection, right? You might still be sitting on SharePoint on premises. You might be okay today, but at a certain point, you're going to want to modernize. You're going to want to do SharePoint hybrid. You're going to want to start to do SharePoint Online. At a certain point, you start to think like, hey, when do we want to look at ourselves and do a self-reflection and start to think about some of the newer components that we might have in the modern story? So when we usually talk about InfoPath, the sort of the one-to-one correlation that we get from the Power Platform side is Power Apps, right? We talk about InfoPath, we're building forms. In Power Apps, we can kind of build forms, but we can create mobile apps as well. But a lot of times people kind of say like, oh yeah, like if I want to take on the new version of InfoPath, I'm probably doing that in Power Apps. So the tagline that we often talk about when we talk about InfoPath and Power Apps correlation is this concept that Power Apps is a replacement for InfoPath. It kind of is. You wouldn't be completely wrong, but we usually try to qualify it and change and shift that conversation a little bit and saying it's not necessarily a replacement, because replacement makes it seem like it's a one-to-one. Number one, it's not the same technology, right? Number two, InfoPath is very much focused on just SharePoint only specific workload. If you work with InfoPath in the past, you probably know that for the most part, and you can connect that to SQL Server. I know you could put C# backend if you wanted to in an InfoPath, but for the most part, InfoPath was used to traverse through and create user interface that's completely customized with a SharePoint list on the back end, maybe with some components inside of SharePoint document library, right? But for the most part, I'm only working with SharePoint lists, where Power Apps, it's not a SharePoint only component, right? So if you've got nothing else from today's presentation, I'm sorry to have wasted your time, but the one thing that you should take away from the presentation is Power Apps definitely is the lens to your SharePoint workload and could do a lot of the form modernization that you could do with the SharePoint sitting on the back end, but it's not tied in just in SharePoint, right? We have this concept of pre-built data connectors. At this point, we're looking at over 400 commercial connectors that's available. And at this point, the last time I counted is 138 GCC approved pre-built connectors. Right? So if you wanted to do an email from your application that starts from the SharePoint list, you can do that without any development need, right? Because the pre-built connector is already there. If you wanted to wait, if there's something happening in ServiceNow, in order to take that and move that into a Teams chat, and also gives you that push notification because it's now in Teams, all those components available through Power Apps and Power Automate, and these concept of data connectors sort of happening behind the scenes in order to be able to take information that lives in or out of the Office 365 land and being able to push that out to even data that's sitting on premises. right? So we have sort of this a little bit of a arena that opens up in the Power Apps world that the InfoPath could never provide before. Now, here's also another good sort of like InfoPath. This is how it works now, right? And Power Apps, this is kind of how we're trying to change the mind shift moving forward. If you talk to developers in the past, which I have tried to convince them, it's like, hey, you know, try this low code world, right? And you can develop sort of out of this low code world. Technically in InfoPath, you can put a C# code behind InfoPath, like admin approved template, right? It's not the best case scenario. Developers just flat out hate InfoPath because it's going to come to a point where InfoPath is really, really good for citizen developer, but it may meet only like 80 or 90% of your requirement. The last 10% leg would require potentially a developer to come in to help you unlock the rest of the 10%, right? With InfoPath, it was very hard to get that last 10% if you need it, right? It's almost like I pick citizen developer and I'm kind of stuck with the citizen developer only. I can't talk to a developer now and be able to bring it into the fold. With Power Apps, it's no longer the case, right? With Power Apps, there's an opportunity to bring out things like putting code behind functions natively into the Power Apps itself. And once it's actually brought in as a reusable connectors, anybody that do not have a development background could actually reuse that code behind just doing point and click, right? So hypothetically, I might have a line of business data that sits on premises that is proprietary to your organization, right? We don't have a pre-built connector to it. What you could potentially have is a custom connector to that line of business data. So the custom connector would then get created by the professional developer. They would have to do the work one time. They publish that as an API that's accessible through the connector, right? Now you have the connector. And as a citizen developer, again, I associate myself more as a citizen developer. I simply just point to it. I said, I want that thing that developer created. And then I will be able to then access that line of business data from my Power application. Things like that were very impossible to do in InfoPath. And I swear, we're going to get out of the deck soon. If you just hang with me, I probably have about 3 or 4 more, and we'll get to actually building itself. A couple more things in terms of InfoPath and Power Apps analogy. In the InfoPath world, we have the InfoPath filler, and where you have to bring out the client application. You can also use and consume the forms using a browser as well. In the Power Apps world, everything is done through the browser, which you can do in your desktop and also open up an iPad. But we also have a first-party mobile app offering as well. So you can open it up in Android, you can open it up in iOS. Those of you that has a Windows phone out there, you could open up as well through that first-party mobile app. So from a security perspective, anybody here that's interested in like managed device, managed application, right? All those components you can control to make sure that when people are accessing your organizational data, that they're doing it in a safe way, right? They're not hitting it from Turkey, or if they're doing something suspicious and fishy, go ahead and actually reset their password while they're accessing those Power applications in their mobile, right? All those are fair game. All right, let's go ahead and actually just, let's do this one and then we'll go on building. In the InfoPath world, we have the thing called the rules. What you're gonna see if you haven't used Power Apps much is this concept of Power FX. The idea is that as you are working through logics to make sure that your form works and your apps works just the way you want it, in the InfoPath world, you're essentially doing a lot of drop down, picking the data sources, right? Doing kind of minus, plus, if then visible, yes, no, right? Like disable, yes, no. Those components carry over to the Power Apps world. The only difference is that a lot of what you're going to be doing is not only through the UI, and as you get to more into the intermediate and advanced side, we are using this thing called the Power FX. Power FX is a simple language that is kind of like Excel-like. So if you've done macros or you've done a lot of like VLOOKUP kind of calculation-based things in terms of scripting in Excel, all of those skills are going to carry over inside of the Power Apps world. You're going to be doing a lot of parens. There's a lot of quotation. There's a lot of comma. There's a lot of nested paren, right? You're going to see what that looks like if you haven't worked much with Power FX. What's awesome about Power FX, though, the product group has made this entire language syntax, right? That, again, is not meant for pro developer. It's meant for citizen developer to be able to learn and get up to speed without knowing C#, without knowing .NET, to be able to use all these nested ifs, right, and be able to get productive in the app development world, they made this PowerFX syntax available as an open source. What's cool about that, now we're telling the community from a product perspective, hey, community, you have the opportunity to provide feedback on how we evolve this PowerFX vision, right? As the community comes in, they might notice an issue, they might notice an improvement that could be needed in the PowerFX syntax. They're going to provide those feedback right into the open GitHub repo for PowerFX that is earmarked and has the attention of all the leaders and the product group for Power Apps and Power Platform. What that's going to do is it gives you kind of this tug and pull and negotiation and open feedback loop with the community to kind of take this language to the next level, right? And those product feedback is going to get fed right back into the product improvement as well. So I'm really excited that PowerFX has now become an actual normalized language that is in the open source community, because it not only is going to push our product into the right direction, it also gives you the opportunity to get more up to speed to learn the PowerFX syntax, and also give you the mechanism to give the feedback back to the product group through the open source community. All right, just real quick here before we build. The two things that we're going to focus on today with the SharePoint data backend. Number one, because we're short on time, I'm not going to be able to share. There is, just to simplify it, two ways to create an app with the SharePoint data source as a backend. The first way is to create a Canvas app in Power Apps and having the SharePoint as the data backend, and being able to then work with the Power App in the iOS or Android, kind of like what you're seeing here. And then as you're interacting with the app in iOS and Android, it's sending those data and being able to do read, write, delete back with the SharePoint list on the backend, right? Because we are making those capabilities not only available in iOS and Android as a mobile device, and it's also available in the browser through accessible in both Mac OS and PC, I can also take the embed, and we'll show you what that looks like, and put it on a SharePoint page as well. Right, so what you're seeing here is an illustration that the same exact app that's available to you at the mobile mobile app form factor, is also available to you through the browser that can be embedded on a SharePoint page, which is fantastic, right? And then what we're going to spend a little bit of time in doing, if you haven't seen it before, is that InfoPath modernization conversation, right? If I am opening up a SharePoint list form, when I click on the list form, I can open it up before, either using a SharePoint list native form, which you can still do now. Number two, I can open it up using InfoPath, which I can still do now. Number three, if you are looking into the modern story, especially in SharePoint Online, the third option would be using Power Apps to be able to create that lens of user experience and user interface. So let's go ahead and actually show you what that looks like if you haven't seen it before. So what I'm going to do is simply just carry this guy over here. You're going to see here is a SharePoint modern form, right? I haven't done anything fancy to it. If you haven't seen this, like, this is just using the out of the box list capabilities to display different tickers differently. So in this case, I just chose different colors to visually present, but all of this is really out of the box SharePoint list form in SharePoint Online. If you click on new, you'll see like this is the out of the box, again, SharePoint list form in order to be able to create new lists item, delete, or update a new list item. What I've done before I start to customize this using Power Apps, beforehand, I created a standalone Canvas app, right, which is what you're seeing here, with the SharePoint list backend. You can see here, I can embed it on the SharePoint page, which I've done. So if I click on this and be able to create a new t-shirt order, right? Let's just go ahead and pick some random one. I want to do a red dog. Let's do medium, right? Click OK. What you could see, because this is simply just a Canvas app that I've embedded on a SharePoint page, the backend is really still SharePoint. So now you're giving the opportunity for user to access it in a SharePoint page as a standalone app in the browser, or this user, if they have like a GFE mobile device, they can simply just open up the mobile and be able to interact through the iOS and Android, right? On the back end, if I were just to go ahead and refresh, you can see that's the new t-shirt order that's come in, the dog one that's medium is red, right? So that's the first option that we can have, standalone app with a SharePoint list in the backend. What else? The other thing that I could do is also do what's called customized form. When I'm doing this, what I'm telling SharePoint list is when I click on a SharePoint list item, don't open it up using a SharePoint native list form. I want to use a Power Apps in order to create that new user experience and give you a different lens to the backend of SharePoint, right? So again, this is kind of like if you're living in InfoPath world before, or even right now, this is kind of where you would be doing most of your interaction, right? Like if when the user clicks, I want to make sure a user goes into a very customized view and user experience instead of the SharePoint one, which is great, into a fully customized one that I could create using Power Apps. And let's go ahead and actually just make a couple of changes here. I'm going to go into settings very quickly, and you could see inside of the display here, I can actually even take a landscape component, right? So when I'm doing a landscape, I'm taking more of a sideway look instead of a smaller one that's more mobile focused, maybe turning it to a little bit more friendly towards, things like iPad and tablet and things like that. And then when I click on this, what you could see is I have the ability, let me go ahead and actually zoom in so hopefully you can see better, to work with different things called the data card. The idea is that because I am hooking up with SharePoint lists on the back end, Power Apps is going to make it easy and says, okay, I have X amount of columns that you can traverse through as a user. What do you want to do as a maker, right, or developer of this Power Apps in order to move the order around, change the presentation, change the label of the field, all through this UI-based type of interaction, right? So you can see here, I have like title that's available here on the at the top. You notice that I've actually used the default value in title so that any new list item that's created is going to have the word t-shirt order on it, right? And that's all just out of the box SharePoint. You can see that Power Apps is smart enough to know if there is any list settings that is defaulted on the SharePoint side to adhere to those default settings that the service SharePoint has actually set. So in this case, like for the user, maybe I don't care. Every time a user create a new t-shirt order list, it's always going to say the word t-shirt order on the title field, right? So I feel like it's a little bit pointless to just show it because it's always going to be the same. Let's go ahead and actually remove it. You can see as I remove the field here on the right-hand side, the app and the form that is showing it is going to be following what I am traversing through in the user interface. Let's do one more. Like maybe I want to put category at the top, right? So I'm going to change the dog category before I show up color green. I can do that. Let's do one more thing. What I'm going to do is let's go ahead and actually just do, let's make it go halfway here. And let's do one more thing in that I want to start to show what PowerFX actually is. So if those of you haven't worked with the scripting language PowerFX much, you get to see it here today. What I want to quickly illustrate is maybe you can see that there's a drop down here, right? Whether I want to do a dog or a cat t-shirt. What I perhaps want to do is, as a user selecting cat or dog, maybe show a little picture to be a little as a visual indicator to the user what I'm actually selecting. What I can do here is simply, let's go ahead first unlock this so we could do a little bit of customization. Use what we call the media control, right? In this case, I have an image control here. I'm going to go ahead and just slap it in here. You could see very quickly, I'm kind of doing dragging and dropping. Again, no code, low code component that I'm doing inside of Power Apps, right? And from here, what I can do is upload very quickly different types of icon and pictures that I want to do. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and actually put in a cat picture and a dog picture, right? Very simply, localized in the app itself. So once I've already uploaded those components in the app, this image control here, I can make it, hey, I can make it into a cat, right? There's a cat. Let's go ahead and actually make this bigger so you can see the cat clearer, right? Or if I want it to show up as a dog, I can just take dog. There's the dog. But what I want to do is kind of like a conditional formatting, right? As I'm selecting that drop down and click on cat, what if I show that as a cat picture? And if I select that drop down to a dog, I need to show that up as a dog, right? So let's start to do what we call PowerFX. Any of these components that I'm touching this, so the data input similar to what we have in InfoPath, where you're having the data input on the right-hand side of the control, we have the similar components in Power Apps inside of what we call the tree view, right? So every control, my drop-down, my text box, is all going to show up here in the tree view. So this drop-down control here, because I am using the template that happens during the customized form for SharePoint is automatically going to rename all these components for me. So that dropdown right now is going to be renamed as data card value 3, which is helpful, right? But it's not too helpful. Like, what does value 3 means? So let's go ahead and actually change that to, hey, data card value category. Right. So once I do that, I know that every time I'm calling data card value category, I'm referring to this dropdown. So let's go ahead and actually start to venture in what this PowerFX actually means. So let me go zoom in here. And what I can do, let's see, can I do this? I want to show the picture, but zoom in on the scripting. All right, here you go. Try it one more time. Here you go. All right. So here I'm going to do if, right? Again, there's a lot of nested if, and this is where we start to say, hey, if you're comfortable with doing macro type of scripting, you're going to carry those skill set over to Power Apps and PowerFX, right? There's an if else statement. So what I can do is I'm going to look for that data card value, right? Which is that value category, if you remember. Because it's a dropdown, I'm going to say if a user is selecting that dropdown, and that selecting dropdown is a dog, right? If that dropdown right there, you can see that it's actually selecting it and making it green, because Power Apps has this thing called the intelligence, trying to help you to see, like, as you're typing things out, pointing out where in the form in the app that actually applies to. So in this case, if a user selects the dog, I want to show a dog image. Right? Otherwise, I want to show a cat image. Right, so let me go ahead and actually zoom out. If we test this out real quick, this should be functional already. If I click cat, boom, cat picture. If I click dog, boom, dog picture. But there's probably one more thing that I need to do, because if I put a blank one, it's going to just go back to the first image that's there, which is a cat, right? So we want to maybe show it as blank. So let's go ahead and do one more work in here. Let's go ahead and actually zoom in. And I want to do a nested if on top of that. So I want to do, hey, if I'm doing data card value, right? The same exact dropdown that I had there. And if a user is selecting blank, right? Oh, let's go ahead and value. If the user is selecting blank, I want to do blank. Oh, I'm sorry, not this. I meant to do is blank, which is another script, right? So if the user didn't select anything in the dropdown, I want to show the image as blank. Otherwise, I want it to show up as cat or dog. Let's go ahead and see. Hopefully I didn't mess things up here. And then now if we run this, you can quickly see that if I select cat, it will show up as cat. If I select dog, it will show up as dog. And if I clear this out, the image kind of goes away. Right? That's probably the biggest learning curve inside of Power Apps as you're kind of getting used to it, is understanding sort of the syntax and how things are working using the PowerFX language. So if I were to go ahead in here and just save it and publish this out to SharePoint, what we can do is now show you that this is already running inside of the list form itself, right? So if I were to click on any of the t-shirt order now, you notice that it's already taking up the entire form. I'm no longer using the SharePoint list form. SharePoint list setting is smart enough to say, hey, Bobby's already customized this using Power Apps. I'm going to use Power Apps to render the information instead of using the SharePoint list form, right? So you can see that that's a dog now. If I were to go ahead and actually empty it out, it would be empty. And then here's the cat picture, right? Very simple illustration. Hopefully it kind of gets the message across. But I did want to show you one thing before we move on to the next step here, which is the list setting inside of SharePoint Online. It's very important to see that, hey, not only do you have the default SharePoint form that I can fall back to if I don't like the changes that I have inside of Power Apps, I can modify the Power Apps experience natively through the SharePoint list setting as well. And it's important, very important to notice that InfoPath is still supported even in SharePoint Online up to 2026, right? You have the end date there, but it's still supported today. So if you have InfoPath modernization that you still want to carry over the SharePoint Online from on-premises, that's still very much supported today, as you can see through this user interface here. All right. Let's keep going here. I know we have, Yeah, let's keep going if that's okay. If you have any questions, please put them in chat. I'll do my best to try to get to it, but I think I've probably gotten a little ambitious with the content here. Well, let's get through it, and hopefully we can get through the rest of the content. You probably know this already if you're working with InfoPath form, but there is a way to do scanning mechanism that's available through the docs.microsoft world to be able to take scanning tools to find out how much InfoPath forms and SharePoint Designer workflows that you have in your on-premises environment and also in SharePoint Online. Of course, we support and very much work very closely with third-party providers in order to be able to provide you those analytics and help you with your modernization process too, right? Because in at least this is, take this as sort of Bobby's lens to this, right? If I just want to simplify your different forms as you are scanning those SharePoint farms, scanning those SharePoint sites and site collections, right? And getting your InfoPath footprints and landscape right now, I kind of see like three big sort of like form categorization where it falls. Number one, and I'm guilty of this a lot, is like, hey, stuff that you just don't need. You don't need to migrate those. You don't need to modernize those. If you're just doing tests for InfoPath maybe 7 years ago, and no one has really touched those InfoPath forms, you're just testing it this one day. You wanted to maybe like test out the SOAP get manager, right? You figured it out, you kind of forgot to delete those form. Well, maybe you don't need to carry those components into Power Apps or into SharePoint Online, right? So most likely as you're doing scanning components, there's going to be that first category of stuff that you just don't need to carry those garbage into your new pristine components that might be in SharePoint Online. So do we have something that is just going to go away and no longer needed that you can leave behind or trash? Okay. So to simplify it, and I'm probably going to get some argument here, there's these two big components that I see as you're kind of categorizing your form, right? One that I call simple from a data permission modeling. The other one I call more complex and enterprise focus. And at this point, some of you probably wondering, it's like, oh, what is he talking about? What is simple? What is complex, right? So I have just this very quick checklist of components like, hey, answer these different components. Hopefully it's going to get you to where you're going to shelf things into simple versus complex, right? One of the first questions very easily, I just ask, hey, do you need to interact in your applications with any on-premises or non-Microsoft 365 services, right? So in the scenario that I have a ServiceNow account, I have Oracle that I need to bring in, I have SharePoint Server Enterprise still on-premises that I need to interact with. If you say yes to all of those, that automatically puts you in a semi-complex because you're working across multiple data estate that's not just in one Microsoft 365 that is focused more on personal productivity and team-based or department-focused conversation. The other question that I might have is your data relational? What do I mean by that, right? And you probably see this a lot. And I'm guilty of this too in terms of different forms that you may have built or maybe even consider building right now in InfoPath, right? So this could be like an expense report type of activity, right? When we talk about expense report and we have to report expense, it's not just that, hey, I bought like $2 worth of ebook yesterday and I want to get paid that $2. It talks about like, hey, what's the charge code? Who's the approval chain? What's the line item? What month is this expenses from? Who is submitting this? And who's this person's manager, right? There's kind of like this webbing of information that kind of goes sideways. In the SharePoint world, we often use SharePoint lookups, right? Like, hey, one list item here talks to another list item here. But in the world, just in the expenses, you start to not just talk about two lists across, you could like potentially scale out to 4, 5, 6, 7 different lists. When you do that, you have these like 7 to 10 different lookups. You start to ask questions like from permissioning perspective, right? Like, is it the safe way to go? From data modeling perspective, is SharePoint really right? You start to have to ask you questions. You ask yourself these different questions because as much as we are coming from the SharePoint backend, right, it's really not meant for these relational database focused information that goes sideways. SharePoint is really good about flat structure that could contain one, perhaps two lists. The moment you start to stitch sideways with all these different lists that needs to relate one to another, it starts to fall apart, right? You start to have to create something with JavaScript, jQuery to kind of stitch that back up together. Perhaps use a Power Apps, but then what you're doing with the data backend on the end for from a component of making sure that it's secure, that the right people are looking into it. Right, so if you're working with SharePoint and InfoPath specifically, if you have a lot of lookup fields, if you're using repeating sections, repeating tables, which I know I used a lot of in my InfoPath day, most likely there's probably some relational data in there, right? We kind of touched up on this already. Is there a permission models that you're using, right? Because if you're doing a lot of item level permissions, if you're SharePoint people, that's just a no-no anyways, right? The more item level permission you're doing, the harder it's going to do audits, the harder it's going to do to kind of roll back, the harder it's going to do to add a new person into your team because you're breaking inheritance every single item level, right? So the moment you're trying to say, oh, this manager needs to see this bucket information, that manager needs to see that, right? That starts to be also another question is that, hey, is SharePoint really the right data source that you have to run this on the back end? We already touched up on this. If you are doing any InfoPath admin approved forms, please, that can't go into SharePoint Online anyways, right? That means there's custom development somewhere in there. Let's try to do better. Let's try to think about another solution instead of sticking that back into an InfoPath in the back. So the quick gut check that I have to put yourself in simple is if you pretty much answer no to all of this. If you answer no to all of this, yeah, I would classify you as a simple. Stick that into SharePoint list, use Microsoft List, put a Power Apps canvas on top, use that as the mobile experience, put the customized list form that we just did as a group. You're probably good to go. There's probably no problem, right? Most likely, that's probably a smaller subset of apps. It doesn't have to be completely enterprise. It's not super customized. You have a Teams need. Let's go ahead and actually not just complicate the matter, put it in the SharePoint list and kind of be done with. There are a couple of useful resources, so this has been helpful. I'll make sure to get this out to Nick and the team to make sure that you have this slide deck available to you. A lot of really good resource out there, a lot of awesome resources that's available by the community members like April Dunham, Shan Young. They lead a lot of really good videos with SharePoint actually leading as a solution backend. So we have a lot of really good resources about transforming InfoPath to Power Apps and also what to do once your data is in the SharePoint list to actually use Power Platform on top of that to traverse through those information. Now, if you are saying yes to any of these components, right, you fall probably in some of this semi-complex and semi-enterprise that you're looking for. So there is kind of like this concept of differentiating your apps, right? And by the way, this is not a new concept. If you're doing knowledge management and portal, you're kind of doing this pyramid of content anyways, right? The stuff that sits on the top have a lot more people hitting it. The stuff that sits on the bottom has just you, maybe your manager, maybe two other people hitting it. So you have to kind of differentiate, like, how much is your content getting pushed out to people? How many apps are really being used across your organization? What is that data backend in terms of scalability and the amount that it touches from an organizational standpoint, right? So this concept of prioritization is going to help drive you sort of like which solution you're going to as well. Because obviously the more critical it is, the more people it touches, the more leadership actually needs access to an accurate backend that's near real time, the more criticality, the higher priority is going to actually get pushed. The higher priority gets pushed, it's a different subset of requirements that gets put from a solutioning perspective, right? So to go back to this original deck that we had, earlier in the beginning of the conversation, what we have is to answer to these different type of requirements, whether you're extending Office 365 all the way out to the enterprise world, right? Behind the scene, we talked about SharePoint majority of this presentation, but really as a part of the Power Platform offering, we have this thing called the Microsoft Dataverse, which is our first party data platform offering, right? What gets lost in the mix when we talk about data platform, because at the top, we're kind of seeing like the sexy UI, UX sort of stopping at the top here, right? That's where we spend a lot of the conversation and demo and envisioning with customers and folks using it sort of at the top layer. Can we show this in a way where it's transformation? And I don't want to knock that part because that's an important part, but equally as important, where's the data being stored? We could cover in terms of the connectors, and part of those connectors and that data could live in SharePoint. It could live in Excel spreadsheet, right? But can we do better in terms of being able to use the first party data platform, which is Dataverse, for performance reason, for security reason, if anything else, that it comes with the platform already that's relational in nature. right? So for example, if you just need the relational data, but not the complex and custom development and connection to on-premises, we have an offering in Dataverse called Dataverse for Teams. Now, with Dataverse for Teams, it looks like I'm running out of time, so I probably can't show the Dataverse for Teams today, but the idea behind Dataverse for Teams is I can create application natively inside of Teams using the same Canvas app experience that you saw that we did together with SharePoint. The difference is that on the back end, I have the data platform already living through Dataverse for Teams that I can stitch this data relationally in the back end as well. Right, so if you have invoicing needs, for example, that you want to deliver as the lens of Teams through Dataverse for Teams, you could do that. You can create the UI, UX through Dataverse for Teams Canvas apps, but in the back end, the data platform, your expense to expense report to user information to expense code, right? Those relational one-to-many, many-to-many, one-to-one, all those components are all delivered as part of the same solution. I wanted to say if anybody here has a vaccine attestation requirement for your federal organizations, our Microsoft Federal actually made available solution at no additional cost through Dataverse for Team called the Vax app. So if you have vaccine attestation requirement that you're trying to solve for your organization, we do have the Vax app actually delivered to Dataverse for Teams at no additional cost. I should have actually added into this slide, so I'll make sure to do that and give that to Nick and the team before we turn over the deck to you. But the Vax app is available for anybody to be able to download and install the solution template so that anybody in the organization can quickly attest to their vaccine status and be able to deliver that through Dataverse for Team at no additional cost through Office 365 licensing. So I don't have time for that, so I apologize for not managing my time correctly. Dataverse for Team is available through GCC offering today. It's TBD for GCC High and DoD, and as we get closer and get more clarity from product group, we're happy to share with you the timeline of when those services will be delivered at GCC High and DoD, right? So if you haven't used Dataverse for Teams in the past, there's a lot of learning modules out there, including from Microsoft Learn. So again, this deck is going to be made available to you. You can click on this Learn modules and be able to walk through creating a new app and the data modeling components through Dataverse for Teams by following that module. Now, we talked about relational data only, right? If that's the first check that you have, you don't need anything else below that, you can use Dataverse for Teams. But if you need something else that's like complex permission model, you need to connect to on-premises data, you would most likely require the full-blown Dataverse, right? Now, Dataverse, we kind of touched up on this. Dataverse for Teams, it's only available through the Teams offering. It's the same exact data platform, but it gives you a much richer offering, you know, especially if you care about like ALM, DevOps, right? All those components that is very specific to app development language and running development, agile development in your organization. Microsoft Dataverse is really the spot for you. So you know what, let's skip all this, but I wanted to chat through what Dataverse provides in terms of different experiences. So what we spent a lot of time on today is what we call the Canvas app experience. You've pixel perfect, that's ready for mobile and iOS. You have very much a mobile-friendly view of that as well, but in a different form factor. So we have model-driven apps and portals as well that will allow you to scale out to external folks that maybe you might want to provide information for folks that are your partners, your agencies that are your sister and brothers agencies through your use of portals, and all of those back end uses the commonality is your Microsoft Dataverse, right? So once you get to the Dataverse land, it kind of gives you the various form factors that you wouldn't otherwise get if you didn't get into Dataverse.
Hey, Bobby, before you go too much farther, we do have a hand raised, so I'm going to unmute.
Please.
AR, if you want to ask your question, you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much. Hey, everyone. This is AR Pigodi from Department of Transportation. I'm a contractor there representing SAIC. I know Bobby, we worked before.
Yeah, absolutely. How are you doing?
Good. I just want to add something to your deck or conversation that you made. leverage the Center of Excellence, for Power Platform. That's an amazing tool, especially for the administration and governance part of it. It's great. So I just want to mention that to make sure that everyone else downloads that and install.
Yeah, good call out, AR. And it looks like Jamie had already dropped in the link for the COE Starter Kit. So definitely a good shout out there for COE Starter Kit, especially for people like yourself that is running governance of all of the Power Platform activity across the entire tenant, right? So thanks so much for chiming in there, AR.
Sure, thanks.
Yeah. And just a quick shout out, AR is doing a lot of components with Power Platform with DOT. So we're really excited to have him kind of lead the way for DOT and starting to actually have conversation with other federal agencies, especially in the civilian space too. So really appreciate you joining the call here today, AR. You know what? I think that's really it. Well, maybe let's wrap up with this because we kind of touched very briefly across Dataverse for Teams and sort of the main difference with the full-blown Dataverse, right? So the biggest two differentiator between Dataverse and Dataverse for Teams is number one is there is a cap in Dataverse for Teams, like 1 million rows, right? That seems like it's not so much, but as you can imagine, like if you're doing like something like a vaccine attestation, right? We have some federal agency that's like in a 400 or 600,000, right? Especially in the DoD space. Like if you start to just do the math, if everybody just attests their vaccination once, if they have like an organization of 500,000, right? You're already halfway there in terms of reaching to 1 million rows. So there are components like that. That's why I think from a Dataverse for Teams component, it gives you a good flavor to get started, to get an understanding of what the data modeling capabilities would be sort of in the back, behind the scene. But you're not stuck there, right? Where you get to a point where, hey, I can no longer get 100% usage of Dataverse for Teams. There's a very quick upgrade process from Dataverse for Team to Dataverse, where you get the full-blown ALM components, you get the full-blown security model that's not just associated with the team's members and owners construct from a permission perspective. I can get very specific about the type of role and hierarchy in terms of where you sit in the organization and how much data you can actually see through the application, all delivered through the UI in Dataverse. Right, so we don't give you a path where, hey, if you pick in Dataverse for Teams, you decide at a certain point you've kind of run out of its capacity, and then you're kind of stuck there. If you need to upgrade it, it's a very quick one-click upgrade from Dataverse for Team to Dataverse. So the idea is that although we're kind of starting this journey and conversation using SharePoint and having Power Apps, which is awesome, right? I love that story. I just want to be mindful because coming in from SharePoint, I'm kind of the guy that always says, hey, can we push SharePoint first as a solution? When it really comes down to it, it does solve a lot of needs, but it also doesn't for a lot of the use cases that's very specific, especially around item level permissions and around some modeling that's could be data focused, that's relational heavy, right? So I just want to do I just want to challenge the group to say, hey, is there an opportunity to categorize the form and sort of bucketize where they actually fit in, because the Power Platform is very over-encompassing, and there's an opportunity to use different parts of the platform in order to deliver the use case that you're looking for. Sorry, I went a little over there. I was hoping to show the Dataverse for Teams, but I wanted to respect your time too. Wanted to open the floor back, or at least maybe give it back to Nick to see where you want to take the rest of the session to.
Yeah, well, we don't have to have a hard stop, but I certainly appreciate you coming to a good pausing point for anyone who has to drop. So, Bobby, I mean, if you want to stay around for anyone who has additional questions or Q&A, welcome to keep the meeting open. What I will say is we are planning additional sessions with kind of a dev, Teams, Power, Teams as a platform, Power Platform theme this fall. We've had a pretty heavy security focus over the summer, so trying to keep the content diverse. So for anyone who is really interested in this area, definitely look for the upcoming sessions in the next couple months, and there's going to be a lot more content about everything from Dataverse to Teams extensibility to just developing and extensibility for Microsoft 365. But definitely, please, I'm going to turn off the moderation. So anybody who would like to come off mute and ask questions or discuss or just give Bobby any feedback, please definitely do so. And for anyone who has to drop, thank you so much for attending this session of our meetup. Please spread the word amongst your friends and colleagues. And if there's any sessions that you would really like or content you'd really like to see, please let us know.
Hey, Nick, it's Andy. Did you get to have your question asked, or you want me to ask your question for you, or don't forget about it?
Oh, good point. Yeah, Bobby. So when you, I'd put something in the chat, but on your slide where you're talking about the differences between Dataverse for Teams versus full Dataverse, I know it says per environment, and my understanding is you can define multiple environments for a tenant. Is there like a particular, can I create as many Dataverse for Teams environments as I want? Like can you speak a little bit about just how that works?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good question, Nick. So number one, the capacity in terms of storage that you're using from the Dataverse for Teams side doesn't actually count towards the tenant allocation that you have through Dataverse, right? So the activity that you're having as you're storing those components in Dataverse for Teams, they don't bleed over to the capacity that you have if you have Dataverse licensing enabled in your tenant. So that's number one thing that I would like to call out to begin with. Number two is that every Teams that you create that you want to put Dataverse for Teams applications on top would get created a separate environment and a way to actually manage and govern that differently than any other environments that you have inside of your tenant, right? So if you have a vaccination application that you want to put in the vaccination focused teams, that would create its own set of environment, and you're able to govern how you want to push out those applications. So the administrator would have the opportunity to be able to take away, restrict, enable those components just for that environment. So every team could potentially have its own environment for the Dataverse team that you want to light up there. Same way as the Dataverse side too, as you're doing more of the DevOps and ALM components, you can create as many or as little environment to make sure that you're doing, the dev stage testing appropriately. And all of our governance controls could be pointed to certain components to be able to be, again, as restricted as you can or as open as you need to be. And what's good about that is the flexibility is really up to you, where you can kind of say, when we go back into those triangle model that we chatted with earlier, right, in terms of the priority of the different apps that you're working with, you could get very granular. Let me see if I can get there. In terms of saying, hey, if I have things that are critical, I'm going to be a little bit more lenient in terms of the different applications and services that I'm going to let this application connect to. Where if it's like productivity, hey, if it's just Nick creating an application for himself, I probably don't want him to be creating things that is hooking up to his Fitbit that could then talk to OneDrive for Business and be able to traverse through those data estates. So you can get very granular and restrictive in both the Dataverse for Teams and the Dataverse through the governance component. Went a little bit on a tangent to answer your questions, Nick.
Oh,
hopefully that
great
covers
answer.
it.
Thank you, Bobby.
Oh, of course. Is there anything else? I haven't been really religious about looking at the chats, but if I haven't answered your questions, please feel free to bring it back up. We're happy to address it.
No, I think, Bobby, that was a great job. Really appreciate it, and took us through that. Definitely learned stuff. So thank you.
Yeah, of course, Corey. Always good to run into you, albeit virtually, sir.
Yeah, likewise.
All right. Hey, if you do have questions afterwards, please feel free to reach out. And Nick, I'll be sure to give the resources out to you so that the folks that want to have the deck and the useful resources that they want to take on their own time, that they could have something to refer back to as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we will call this a wrap for tonight. I'm going to stop the recording. Anyone who still wants to stay on is certainly welcome to. But thank you, everyone, for attending.